I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but here I am. I'm a 28-year-old guy who's had a pretty rough go of it, especially when it comes to family. My mom died giving birth to me, which I guess set the tone for my relationship with my dad. He never really got over it, and always treated me like I was the reason she was gone. I don't have any memories of my mom, obviously, but I've heard stories from relatives about how excited she was to have me. Apparently, she'd always wanted to be a mother and had struggled with fertility issues for years before finally getting pregnant with me. It makes the whole situation even more tragic, I think. She finally got her wish, only to have it cut short. Growing up, our house was filled with photos of my mom. My dad kept everything exactly as she'd left it, like some kind of shrine. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her books still lined the shelves. It was like living with a ghost. I used to sneak into his room sometimes, just to touch her things, trying to form some connection with this woman I'd never know. My dad, on the other hand, was a different story. He was physically present, but emotionally, he might as well have been on another planet. He'd go through the motions of parenting, making sure I was fed, clothed, and got to school on time. But there was never any warmth or affection. No hugs, no I love yous, not even a pat on the back for a job well done. I always felt like an outsider in my own home. Dad would barely look at me most days, let alone talk to me. When he did speak to me, it was usually to criticize or compare me to my cousin Jake. Jake's dad, my uncle, passed away in a car accident when Jake was 7, so my dad kind of took him under his wing. I remember the day we got the news about my uncle. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and I was doing homework at the kitchen table when the phone rang. My dad answered, and I watched his face crumple as he listened to whoever was on the other end. That was the first and only time I ever saw my dad cry. He hung up the phone, sat down heavily at the table, and just stared into space for what felt like hours. After that, Jake started spending a lot more time at our house. At first, I was excited. I thought maybe having another kid around would make things more fun, maybe even bring my dad out of his shell a bit. But it didn't take long for me to realize that Jake's presence only highlighted the void in my relationship with my dad. He'd always say things like, "Why can't you be more like Jake?" Or, "Jake would never do that." It was like Jake was the son he always wanted, and I was just there. Jake was athletic, outgoing, and charismatic, everything I wasn't. Where I was bookish and introverted, Jake was the life of the party. My dad ate it up. I tried so hard to get my dad's approval. I joined every sports team, got good grades, even tried to learn about his hobbies, but nothing ever seemed to be enough. Meanwhile, Jake could do no wrong in my dad's eyes. He'd praise Jake for the smallest things, while my achievements went unnoticed. There was this one time when I was about 12, and I won a science fair at school. I'd spent weeks working on my project, a complex model of the solar system that actually moved. I was so excited to tell my dad, thinking maybe this would finally make him proud. When I got home, I found him in the living room, laughing and chatting with Jake about some football game. I tried to tell him about my win, but he just nodded and went right back to talking to Jake. It was like I wasn't even there. As we got older, the favoritism only got worse. Jake and I were in the same grade, so we were always being compared. In high school, I actually outperformed Jake academically, but my dad would always find ways to downplay my accomplishments. He'd say things like, "Well, Jake's got more important things to focus on than just grades." I remember one parent-teacher conference where my English teacher was raving about an essay I'd written. She told my dad it was one of the best she'd ever read from a student my age, and that she thought I had a real future as a writer. My dad just grunted and asked if this would help me get a sports scholarship. The teacher looked confused, and I felt my face burning with embarrassment. Despite everything, there was a part of me that still hoped things would change. I thought maybe if I could just find the right thing, the magic key that would unlock my dad's affection, everything would be okay. I spent my entire childhood and teenage years chasing that impossible goal. The real kicker came when it was time for college. I'd worked my butt off, got into a good school, and was ready to start my future. I knew money would be tight, but I figured my dad would help out at least a little. Boy, was I wrong. I'll never forget the day I overheard my dad on the phone with Jake, telling him he'd pay for his entire college tuition. My heart sank. When I asked my dad if he could help me out too, he looked at me like I was crazy. He said, "I can't afford to pay for both of you, and Jake needs it more." Just like that, my college dreams went up in smoke. I tried to make it work anyway. I got a part-time job at a local diner working evenings and weekends. I applied for every scholarship I could find, but it wasn't enough. The stress was overwhelming. I was trying to keep up with my classes, work enough hours to make money and still find time to study and sleep. Something had to give. I ended up having to drop out after the first semester. I couldn't afford it on my own, and the part-time jobs I could get weren't nearly enough to cover tuition. Meanwhile, Jake was living it up at a prestigious university, all on my dad's dime. He'd post pictures on social media of his fancy dorm room, the spring break trips he was taking, the new laptop my dad had bought him for school. Each post felt like a knife twisting in my gut. That was the last straw for me. I packed up my stuff and left home. I cut off contact with both my dad and Jake. It hurt like hell, but I knew I had to get away from that toxic environment. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of my dead mother and the cousin who'd somehow taken my place in my father's heart. The past few years have been a struggle, to say the least. I've been working odd jobs, trying to make ends meet. I've waited tables, worked construction, done night shifts at gas stations, whatever it took to keep a roof over my head and food in my stomach. It's been hard, especially seeing updates from Jake on social media about his amazing college experience and the great job he landed after graduation. But I'm slowly building a life for myself, on my own terms. I've got a decent job now, nothing fancy, but it pays the bills. I'm a manager at a local bookstore. It's not what I imagined for myself, but I enjoy being surrounded by books all day. I'm even taking some night classes at the community college, trying to get that degree I always wanted. It's not easy, but at least I'm doing it on my own. I've made some good friends along the way, people who accept me for who I am, not who they want me to be. They've become the family I never really had. We have weekly game nights, go on camping trips when we can afford it, and are there for each other through thick and thin. It's not perfect, but it's mine, and that means something. I thought I'd left all that family drama behind me, but life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. Yesterday, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I was shocked to hear my dad's voice on the other end. It's been 3 years since we last spoke, and now he's reaching out for help. I'm not sure how to feel about this, but I know one thing for sure. I'm not that same kid desperate for his approval anymore. Update 1. It's been a week since my dad's unexpected call, and I'm still processing everything that happened. When I heard his voice on the phone, it brought back a flood of memories, most of them not so great. He sounded different though, older, more tired, and desperate. He started off with small talk, asking how I was doing. It felt weird and forced, like he was trying to pretend the last few years hadn't happened. Then he got to the real reason for his call. He needed money. A lot of money. At first, I was too shocked to respond. This man, who had never given me a dime for college, who had chosen my cousin over me time and time again, was now asking me for financial help. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I finally found my voice, I asked him why he was coming to me. What about Jake, his golden boy? Shouldn't he be the one to help out? My dad got quiet for a moment, then mumbled something about Jake being busy with his new job and not having the means to help right now. I couldn't help but laugh. After years of being told how much better Jake was, how he deserved the opportunities I didn't, now I was supposed to be the one to step up? I told my dad exactly what I thought about that idea. I suggested he go talk to Jake instead, since he was always the favorite anyway. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then my dad started to say something about how he regretted some of the choices he'd made, how he wanted to make things right. But I cut him off. I told him it was too little, too late. I'd spent years trying to earn his love and approval, and now that he needed something from me, he was ready to play the remorseful father. I ended the call shortly after that. As soon as I hung up, I felt a mix of emotions wash over me. Part of me felt guilty for turning him away. After all, he was still my father. But a bigger part of me felt relieved. For the first time, I'd stood up for myself against him. I didn't cave in to the need for his approval that had driven me for so long. The next few days were tough. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering if I'd done the right thing. I thought about all the times I'd needed help and he wasn't there for me. The college tuition, sure. But it was more than that. All the little moments where a kid needs their dad, school events, advice about girls, learning to drive. He'd been absent for all of it. I remembered my first heartbreak when I was 16. Her name was Sarah, and I thought she was the one. We'd been dating for 6 months when she broke up with me for one of the football players. I was devastated. I came home that day, eyes red from crying, and my dad was in his usual spot on the couch watching TV. He barely looked up when I walked in. I stood there for a moment, hoping he'd ask what was wrong, but he just grunted and told me I was blocking the screen. I went to my room and cried myself to sleep that night, or the time I got my driver's license. Most of my friends' dads had taught them how to drive, but not mine. I had to beg my neighbor, Mr. Johnson, to teach me. When I finally passed the test, I came home excited to share the news. My dad was in the garage, working on his car with Jake. I showed them my new license, and Jake congratulated me. My dad just nodded and went back to explaining something about the engine to Jake. I don't think he ever let me drive his car. I also couldn't help but wonder what kind of trouble he was in that he needed to ask me for money. My dad had always been proud, almost to a fault. For him to reach out like this, it must be serious. Despite everything, a small part of me was worried about him. But then I remembered all the times I'd been worried about my own future, struggling to make ends meet after having to drop out of college. Where was his concern then? I'd had to figure things out on my own, and I did. I built a life for myself, without his help. Why should I rush to his aid now? I thought about my first year after leaving home. I'd moved to a new city where nobody knew me, determined to start fresh. I found a tiny studio apartment that I could barely afford and took any job I could get. I worked as a janitor during the day and a bartender at night. I was exhausted all the time, but I was making it on my own. There were nights when I'd come home from my shift at the bar, feet aching, smelling of beer and cigarettes, and I'd wonder if I'd made a mistake. Maybe I should have swallowed my pride and stayed at home, tried to make things work with my dad. But then I'd remember the constant comparisons, the feeling of never being good enough, and I knew I'd made the right choice. As the days passed, I started to feel more confident in my decision. I realized that by not giving in to his request, I was finally setting a boundary. I was showing him that I'm not the same kid he could push around and ignore. I'm an adult now, making my own choices, and I don't owe him anything. Still, curiosity was getting the better of me. What exactly had led to this situation? Why was Jake, the golden child, suddenly unable or unwilling to help? I found myself tempted to do a little digging, to find out what was really going on with my father and cousin. But I hesitated. Did I really want to open that can of worms? Was it worth potentially stirring up all that old pain and resentment? I thought about reaching out to my aunt, Jake's mom. She'd always been kind to me, even if she was a bit distant. Maybe she would know what was going on. But then I remembered the last time I saw her, at a family gathering just before I left home. She'd hugged Jake goodbye, telling him how proud she was of him for getting into such a good college. When it was my turn to leave, she just gave me a weak smile and a pat on the shoulder. I decided against calling her. As I write this update, I'm still unsure about what to do next. Part of me wants to leave the past in the past and continue focusing on my own life and growth. But another part can't help but wonder what's really going on with my dad and Jake. I guess only time will tell if I decide to investigate further or if I'll let sleeping dogs lie. Update 2. It's been about a month since my last update, and a lot has happened. Despite my initial hesitation, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to do some digging to find out why my dad suddenly needed help and why Jake wasn't stepping up. I started by reaching out to a few family friends who were still in touch with my dad. At first, they were reluctant to share much, but eventually, I pieced together a pretty clear picture of what had been going on. I called Mrs. Peterson first. She'd been my mom's best friend and had always been kind to me growing up. She seemed surprised to hear from me, but was happy to chat. After some small talk, I steered the conversation towards my dad and Jake. Mrs. Peterson hesitated, then sighed deeply before starting to fill me in. It turns out that my dad had gone all in on supporting Jake, way beyond just paying for his college tuition. He'd helped Jake with the down payment on a house, bought him a car, and even invested in a business venture Jake wanted to pursue. To do all this, my dad had taken out loans and maxed out his credit cards. He was drowning in debt, all for the sake of giving Jake the life he thought he deserved. Mrs. Peterson told me about a conversation she'd had with my dad a few years back. He'd been bragging about Jake's successes, talking about how he was going to be a big-shot businessman one day. When she asked about me, my dad had just shrugged and said he hoped I was doing okay. The indifference in his voice had shocked her. Next, I reached out to my old neighbor, Mr. Johnson, the one who taught me how to drive. He'd always been observant and filled me in on some of the more recent developments. Apparently, Jake had convinced my dad to invest in a startup he was launching with some college friends. It was some kind of tech company, but Mr. Johnson wasn't clear on the details. What he did know was that my dad had remortgaged the house to get the money for the investment. The kicker? Jake's new job, the one my dad had bragged about, wasn't going so well. The business venture had flopped, and Jake was struggling to make ends meet himself. When my dad turned to him for help with the mounting debt, Jake apparently told him he couldn't spare anything right now. Mr. Johnson had overheard an argument between my dad and Jake just a few weeks ago. Jake had come over driving a flashy new car, and my dad had confronted him about the failed business and the money he'd invested. Jake had yelled something about how it wasn't his fault the market had changed, and that he'd pay my dad back when he could. He'd peeled out of the driveway, leaving my dad standing there looking defeated. I have to admit, a part of me felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. After years of being compared to Jake, of being told I wasn't good enough, it turned out that the golden child wasn't so golden after all. My dad had put all his eggs in one basket, and now that basket had fallen apart. But mostly, I just felt tired. Tired of the drama, tired of the pain, tired of the what-ifs. I thought about how different things could have been if my dad had invested in me the way he did in Jake. Maybe I would have finished college. Maybe I'd be in a different career. But then again, maybe I wouldn't have learned the valuable lessons I did about self-reliance and perseverance. I remembered my struggle after dropping out of college, how I'd worked multiple jobs, often surviving on ramen noodles and cheap coffee. I thought about the nights I'd spent studying after long shifts, determined to better myself even without a formal education. It had been hard, but it had made me who I am today. I debated whether or not to confront my dad with what I'd learned. In the end, I decided to send him a text. I told him I knew about the situation with Jake and the debt. I didn't offer help, but I didn't gloat either. I simply said that I hoped he could see now that the choices he made had consequences, not just for me, but for him too. He replied a few hours later. His message was long, full of apologies and regrets. He said he realized now how unfairly he'd treated me, how he'd let his grief over my mom's death cloud his judgment. He talked about how proud my mom would have been of the man I'd become, despite his failures as a father. He asked if we could meet to talk things over. I sat with that message for a long time, unsure how to respond. On one hand, a small part of me, the part that was still that little boy desperate for his dad's love, wanted to say yes. I imagined a scenario where we'd meet, talk things out, and magically repair our relationship. But the adult I've become, the one who's had to fight for everything I have, knew better. I thought about all the milestones my dad had missed. My high school graduation, where I'd scanned the audience hoping to see his face, only to be disappointed. My first apartment, which I'd furnished with secondhand items and a lot of determination. The promotion I'd recently gotten at the bookstore, which had no one to celebrate it with except my friends. In the end, I replied that I wasn't ready for a meeting. I told him that while I appreciated his apology, words alone couldn't undo years of neglect and favoritism. I said that I needed time and space, and that he needed to respect that. I also made it clear that I wouldn't be bailing him out financially. His choices had led him to this point, just as my choices had led me to where I am. It wasn't my responsibility to fix his mistakes. As I sit here writing this update, I feel lighter somehow. Not happy exactly, but like a weight has been lifted. For so long, I carried the burden of trying to earn my dad's love, of wondering what was wrong with me that made him favor Jake. Now I see that it was never about me at all. It was about his own issues, his own inability to deal with loss and grief. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with my dad, or lack thereof. Maybe someday we'll be able to have a real conversation about everything that's happened. Maybe not. For now, I'm focusing on my own life, my own growth. I'm continuing with my night classes, working towards that degree. I'm building relationships with people who value me for who I am, not who they want me to be. Last week, I helped my friend Sarah, not the same Sarah from high school, move into her new apartment. As we were unpacking boxes and arranging furniture, I realized that these connections, this chosen family, is what really matters. Not the approval of someone who was never able to see my worth. It's not always easy, but I'm making my own way. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I'm not sure what tomorrow will bring, but I know I'll face it on my own terms, with the strength I've built through years of self-reliance. That's something my dad and his favoritism can never take away from me.